Ladies and gentlemen, good morning. Welcome here to this Cities 2030 conference held jointly between Policy Exchange and the Manhattan Institute. My name is Dean Dodson. I'm Director of Policy Exchange. It's my great privilege to be able to welcome you here today. It's an historic occasion for us to be able to partner with the Manhattan Institute, America's greatest urban policy think tank. And the story of the Manhattan Institute in the whole topic that we're addressing today is, I think, of particular significance. As many of you, I'm sure, are aware, the centre-right in the United States historically had relatively little to say about cities and the urban space. The Manhattan Institute changed all of that, turned it around and showed that centre-right policies could have a viable future and indeed present in contemporary American cities, particularly New York, but now well beyond that with their work in Detroit, Indianapolis, and elsewhere. As many of you will know, they played a huge part in revising how American cities thought about public safety through George Kelling's and James G. Wilson's broken windows theory, which will be familiar to many of you. Also, with their welfare to work policies, they played a huge part in getting people off the welfare rolls and have played an intellectually hegemonic part in that. That's why we are privileged to be able to partner with them here, because in this country as well, the centre-right has too often not given sufficient thought to the problems of our cities. The quality of the audience here today is testament to the importance which I think all of us feel about this subject. It's not merely a privilege to be able to partner with the Manhattan Institute, but I'd also particularly like to say thanks to the City of London, to PwC, for their part in partnering with us. We hope that this will be the first of many. We have a fantastic programme here today, and there's nowhere better to start off on this flagship programme than for me to be able to present to you now Edward Glaeser, one of the world's preeminent economists, specialising in urban issues, and Lord Finkelstein of Pinner, our own chairman, who acts as the bridge to Manhattan through his visiting fellowship and various other roles there at the Manhattan Institute. So without further ado, I'd like to present Lord Finkelstein, Edward Glaeser. Please join me in giving them the warmest of welcomes.
So I'm really delighted to be here, and since I guess I'm the first speaker with a formal affiliation with Manhattan Institute, let me just say how terrific it is to partner also with Policy Exchange, that this is a fantastic British institution and one that I've admired for many, many years. So it really is a great honor to be here. We are, of course, in the midst of a thriving city, of an exciting city, of one of the great cities of the world history. But we are also at a time in which this city, like New York, like many cities of the world, faces deep challenges. And I want to raise those challenges, which I will come to again at the end of the talk. But first among those challenges is the challenge of dealing with inequality, of dealing with the fact that not all of the benefits of prosperity have been shared equally. The second challenge is the challenge of high housing costs. Like the enormously high prices that now London commands are an extraordinary challenge to a city that is inclusive, that is affordable, that is as dynamic as we would like it to be. And three, the third challenge, which is really a challenge for the country rather than for the city, is the declining city challenge, is the fact that not all cities have continued to thrive. Those are, to me at least, the three challenges that I hope we'll continue to talk through today and continue to puzzle through. That being said, let me start with housing. And let me start with a picture of the past 30 years for the United States. These are the Federal Housing Finance Agency's repeat sales index. And what I've done is I've split America's metropolitan areas up into warm metropolitan areas and cold metropolitan areas. And what you can see is that this incredible housing price tsunami that came and afflicted America in the past 15 years was one that happened disproportionately in warmer metropolitan areas. It really was sort of a flood that came in that by and large avoided the cold parts of America, at least to such a great degree. There were significant housing price increases. It was about a 50% increase, but nothing like the over 100% increase that you saw in some areas. This is another way of looking at this great housing boom and bust. This, along the horizontal axis, is the percent change in price between 2001 and 2006. Along the vertical axis is the percent change in price between 2006 and 2011. So it is normal when housing prices go up over a 5-year period for them to descend over the next 5 years. Typically, every dollar within the United States that a metropolitan area goes up over 5 years, it gives back 32 cents on the dollar over the next 5 years. So it's what economists or statisticians call mean reversion. This boom and bust was not 32% mean reversion, it was 95% mean reversion. Every dollar an area went up between 2001 and 2006, it went down by 95 cents subsequently. The other point I think that this makes is that the great housing boom and bust was incredibly heterogeneous within the U.S. There were some areas like Dallas and Houston, areas by and large that are relatively unconstrained in how much they can build, in which prices were relatively flat during the entire time period. And there were places like Riverside and Los Angeles that just had incredible swings over this time period. There were some areas like Midland, Texas, or Washington, D.C. that did disproportionately well over the entire time period. Apparently being a hometown to George W. Bush was very helpful for housing prices over this area. And there's some places like Las Vegas, which did particularly poorly during the bust relative to the boom. And of course Detroit, which is the only place which completely managed to miss the boom and still experience the bust. Now, one thing that does come true throughout the entire time period is one variable which predicts housing price growth is density. And what I've taken here is I've taken the metropolitan areas of the U.S. and I've split them into fifths on the basis of their density levels. And what you can see is between 1996 and 2012, almost all of the growth occurred in that fifth of metropolitan areas that were most dense. But in the least dense metropolitan areas, there was a relatively static housing prices on average. If anything, actually real prices were down. Really all the growth was focused in higher density areas. And this, of course, goes along with this remarkable resurgence of high-density living, of high-density working within the U.S. What I've done here is I've taken the 3,000-odd counties in the United States, and I've split them into tenths. So each one of those dots represents 300 counties, and I've ordered them on the basis of their density levels. Because at their hearts, cities are the absence of physical space between people and firms. Cities are density, proximity, closeness. And what you can see with the bottom line is that the densest tenth of America's counties have incomes that are on average 50% higher than the least dense half of America's counties. This is something economists have been writing about for centuries. And they typically go by the ungainly name of agglomeration economy, with the advantages of being around other people. Now, of course, there's a lengthy literature about where those come from. Does this just sort of represent the tendency of smart people to select into cities, or the fact that cities have access to particular natural advantages? I think actually the weight of the evidence suggests that this is genuinely a treatment effect of actually being around people. The red line shows something which may be somewhat more surprising, which is the relationship between population change and initial density levels. So whereas Americans at the start of the 19th century were leaving their dense enclaves on the eastern seaboard to populate the empty spaces between the oceans, at the start of the 21st century, instead of spreading out, we're clustering in. This is the same map for Europe. These are 1,114 regions within the European Union. The blue line is GDP per capita. If anything, the relationship is even stronger. Notice by the bottom of that is under $15,000 per capita. The top is over $30,000. So it's really a doubling between the least dense areas and the most dense areas within the EU in terms of income. The red line, which I'll give you, is a little bit bumpier than the US. It still shows this general strong positive trend. Shows the relationship between population growth between 2000 and 2010, and initial population density in the EU. This is a general pattern, right? That in fact, large agglomerations, dense areas are doing remarkably well. And of course, anything that is happening in the developed world pales by the transformation that is happening in the developing world. In 2007, we crossed this remarkable halfway point where more than 50% of humanity is now said to live in cities. And it's hard on net not to think that that's a tremendously good thing, because when you compare those countries that are more than 50% urbanized to those countries that are less than 50% urbanized, the more urbanized countries have on average incomes that are 5 times higher, and infant mortality levels that are less than a third. Now, this relatively rosy picture of cities is quite unlike the New York of my youth. And these are two iconic images of New York City in the 1970s. This is President Ford didn't literally say the words drop dead, but certainly the New York Daily News they thought that he actually meant it. And in those years, it seemed that not just President Ford, but history itself was telling New York that it was headed for the trash heap. New York had possessed the largest industrial cluster in the United States in the 1950s. Garment production in New York had more employees than automobile production did in Detroit. And this was a cluster that was hammered by globalization. Hundreds of thousands of jobs lost over a short period of time. Accompanying deindustrialization was rising social chaos. This was the world in which the broken windows theory was born, a world in which crime seemed like it was completely out of control. And this combination of declining industrial base with rising social needs meant that the city's finances were an absolute and complete mess. It really seemed possible that we would be looking forward to a vision, and you can see Jimmy Carter wandering through the wasteland that the South Bronx had become, in which the weeds would come out of the ground and reclaim the once proud towers that had once been there, that we would be looking towards a future, much like that at the end of that great hypothetical point of American culture, Planet of the Apes, where the Statue of Liberty would come poking out of the sand in some future world, and the age of the city would be gone. One reason why the age of the city seemed like it was over was that over the course of the 19th and 20th centuries, we came to associate urbanity with industrialization. And that is very much the theme of the conference today, where we're talking about post-industrial cities. And in the 70s, it was much harder to envision what a post-industrial city meant. And if anything, the issues in the US were more severe because our form of industrialization was so vast, was so large, and was so fundamentally unurban. So if you think about the model of the industrial city, these are cities that are all formed as part of a transportation network, right? Chicago, the great linchpin of a watery arc that went all the way from New York to New Orleans. Liverpool, on the other side of the ocean, connecting again by water with the world. Glasgow, the opening port of the north. These were all areas in which the transportation network was key. Every one of the 20 largest American cities in 1900 was on a major waterway, from the oldest, typically where the river meets the sea, to the newest, Minneapolis, on the northernmost navigable point on the Mississippi River. And in all cases, industry formed around that port. New York's three largest industries in the 19th century were printing and publishing, the garment trade, and sugar refining. These were all there because the sugar refining was there because of trade with the Caribbean, and you couldn't refine sugar crystals and plantations because they would coalesce on a long, hot sea voyage north. I felt like I had to tell the printing and publishing story because it is so germane to this audience. Of course, the big money in 19th century printing and publishing in the US was in pirated English novels. Right? No thief of American property rights today had anything on Our Boys in Manhattan in the 1820s, where, you know, and the thing is, if you're printing pirated novels, you've really got to publish first. There's no percentage in having the 8th pirated edition of you know, Harry Potter and the Deathly Hallows. That, of course, gives a huge edge to being in the Great Court, because in fact you can publish the book immediately as it comes off the wharf. And indeed, this is exactly what gave the Harper Brothers the preeminence. They could flood the market with Peveril at Peak 24 hours after it came off the boat, 2 days before it even showed up in the hands of their Philadelphia competitors, Carrier and Lee. I like that image also because it reminds us of the traditional great urban role in spreading information. But it also reminds us that it's all children of the port. Chicago, of course, is about the stockyards, which are about moving corn in bovine form to the markets of the east, thanks to the refrigerated rail cars of armor. Now, of course, the magical thing about cities is not that they reduce transportation costs for manufacturing. The magical thing is that when smart people come together, they learn from each other and miraculous things occur, right? My favorite example of this that's particularly famous is the spread of ideas in 15th century Florence, where Brunelleschi figures out the basic mathematics of linear perspective, making two-dimensional spaces seem three-dimensional. He passes it along to Donatello, who puts in low-relief sculpture. He passes it along to Masaccio, who puts on the wall of the Brancaccia Chapel. He passes it along to Fra Filippo Lippi, that less than saintly monk. He passes it along to Botticelli, and so forth. A chain of genius, each person riffing on the other idea. A similar chain of genius occurred in the creation of the skyscraper in Chicago in the 1880s, and also in the creation of the automobile. For indeed, it's not just about Henry Ford, who came to Detroit to learn about, to get a job, worked on engines at Detroit Dry Dock. Unsurprisingly, a cutting-edge manufacturing firm that worked to the Great Lakes trade, because of course Detroit was Detroit, the Straits. And they join this great American race to produce cheap cars. And it's not just about Ford, it's about the Ransomy Olds, the Dodge brothers, the Fisher brothers, David Dunbar Buick, Billy Durant in nearby Flint, a chain of genius, a cluster of entrepreneurs much like that occurred in Silicon Valley in the 1960s. And this is what cities do that matters. They create amazing things. The problem was, and there are many issues, but the problem is that this is Ford's big idea. Massive, vertically integrated factory walled off from the outside world. Now, on one level, in terms of short-run productivity, this was phenomenal. By almost any measure, Detroit may have been the most productive place on the planet in 1950. And, $5 days for employees, cheap transportation for ordinary Americans, this is something to cheer at. And yet, for the long run, this is a terrible model for urbanism, right? This type of factory doesn't need the city, it doesn't give to the city, it isn't part of the fabric of urban life, it doesn't create spin-offs. It's a model for short-run productivity, not long-run regeneration. It's so different from the sort of traditional urban model. And if we think back to the world of Matthew Bolton's Birmingham or Alexander Hamilton's New York at the start of the 19th century, successful cities were marked by three things: small firms, smart people, and connections to the outside world. The same three things are markers for urban success at the start of the 21st century. How far from that was Henry Ford's River Rouge, vast vertically integrated factory employing tens of thousands of less skilled Americans? Now, the good news, of course, and this is, three of the reminders of where the Industrial Revolution really started, right? This is Arkwright, of course, that's Bolton's Soho manufactory, and that's an image of Cottonopolis. And if you can see it, you can see lots of little, smokestacks coming up out of Manchester over there. Things occurred on, by and large, a slightly smaller scale, which actually makes things easier. There was more of a residual of entrepreneurship in Manchester than there ever was in Detroit. These places were much smaller, much closer to London, which also makes reimagining them somewhat easier than the Detroit case. So I think there are similarities between your declining cities and ours, but the situation is considerably less enormously difficult than in the case of Detroit. All of these areas were hit with this decline in the cost of moving goods, so while it was once sensible to have a manufacturing center near the old port, that became largely irrelevant as transportation costs plummeted, and as you moved the production of ordinary goods to cheaper cost locales. Right? First, this was the move to lower cost areas within the US, and then, of course, it was the move to lower cost areas throughout the world. This is the 90% reduction in the real cost of moving a ton of mile by rail within the US. But it's just one of many markers of just how much cheaper it has become to move goods, which is the backdrop for the deindustrialization of all of our cities. One way to think about this is what cheaper transportation costs did, is that they meant that we could have cities defined not by places where firms had a productive advantage, but by places where consumers just wanted to live, in places where people had a consuming advantage. And what we've seen in the US, apparently, is that what consumers really wanted was just warmer winters. Because there's no variable which better predicts population growth over the course of the 20th century than January temperature. Now, there are, in fact, at least three major things rolled together in this. One of which is the fact that people actually just did want warmer winters, and that's true. The second of which is that warmer areas in the US tended to have more pro-business policies. So, for example, if you compare the work of Tom Holmes compares counties on opposite sides of right-to-work lines in states. Right-to-work were much more pro-business as opposed to pro-union. Vast increase in manufacturing growth on the pro-business sides of state lines relative to the other side. And the third reason is that the warmer areas in the US have a totally different approach towards delivering housing. Right? You do not understand Atlanta, Dallas, Houston, and Phoenix, and why they each added 1 million people between 2000 and 2010 without understanding that these places make it extraordinarily easy to build mass-produced affordable housing at $60, $70, $80 a square foot. So that's $600, 300 pounds a square meter in terms of the production cost, which is just totally different than anything that we see in terms of the bespoke prices of building in cities. This is, by the way, the temperature relationship to population growth in Europe. Again, the major difference here is not that there's a difference in the relationship with warmth, but rather that the cold areas are literally losing people as opposed to just holding flat. And indeed, we have we'll have lunch with Lord Daniel today, but it's the sort of Liverpool story is one of, again, of sort of enormous challenges of a former industrial hub built around water of coming to terms with a new world. This is what happened to the 10 largest American cities in 1950. 8 out of the 10 lost more than 20% of their population. The healthier ones have managed to stabilize and start to grow again, like Boston. The real disasters lost more than 50% of their population, which is, of course, about the Liverpool story, right? About 50% less than it had at its peak. Now, the remarkable thing, of course, is not that these places lost population, as indeed declining transportation costs would naturally cause a new world, but that they came back. And I think the story here is ultimately that this old urban edge of facilitating the flow of ideas came to be far more important in our age. That what globalization and new technologies did, apart from dispersing manufacturing, was they increased the returns to being smart. They increased the returns to new ideas and innovation. Precisely, in some cases, because you could make it on the other side of the planet, because it increased the scale of our world, ideas became more and more valuable, because you could sell it on the other side of the planet, right? All of these things increase returns to human capital, returns to skill, and we are a social species. We get smart by being around other smart people, right? Cities play to this advantage. 40 years ago, 30 years ago, the cyberseers and the techno-prophets predicted that globalization would make cities obsolete, precisely because you could just fax it in, you could just telecommute in from whatever sylvan spot appeals to your love of nature. But in so many ways, in so many cases, that didn't happen, right? We chose to put up with the costs of living in these older cities. I think the fundamental reason for it is that it is just so important to be in the maelstrom of human activity. You know, anyone who's ever taught knows the hard part about teaching is not knowing your topic. It's knowing whether or not anything you're saying is getting through. And we have evolved over millions of years to have these wonderful cues for communicating comprehension or confusion that are lost when we're not in the same room with each other. Two things I want you to take away from this. One of which is, the quote here is from a billboard that was put up outside Seattle in 1971 when two real estate jokers felt the city was dying because Boeing had been cutting back on the number of jobs. Right? Just as no one could imagine Detroit was smaller General Motors, no one could imagine Seattle was smaller Boeing. Before Amazon, before Microsoft, before Costco, and Starbucks is just the faintest whiff of an aroma. This was not fundamentally about any sort of public sector comeback strategy. This was about smart private sector entrepreneurs. Second thing, of course, this is Bloomberg's Wallace office in City Hall, based on the Wallace office of Bloomberg LLP, based on the Salomon Brothers trading floor. Three things I want to focus on from this, one of which is it reminds us of the enormous role that finance plays in many of our cities' comeback. I have long been worried about the overconcentration in a single industry that has happened for both New York and London. I think that is something to worry about. But we shouldn't be surprised that finance loves cities. If you think that the great urban advantage in the 21st century is spreading knowledge, there's no industry in which a bit of extra knowledge can make you a billionaire quicker than in finance, right? Which is why we shouldn't be surprised that finance, above all, is willing to pay for high prices. I like this image though for two other reasons. First of all, it reminds us that cities are often able to create these leaps of industry that Jane Jacobs talked about in The Economy of Cities that are responsible for some of our greatest entrepreneurial successes. Mike Bloomberg, of course, is not a financial billionaire. He's an information technology billionaire. But he's able to succeed in information technology, competing with the guys in Silicon Valley, precisely because he has run Salomon Brothers trading floor. And when he comes to start his own company, he knows things that no software engineer in Stanford Industrial Park could possibly know, because he's been in the city, because the city has educated, because the city has made him smart. The third point, of course, is it's the Wallace office. And it reminds us of sort of the funny thing about trading floors, that here we have some of the wealthiest people in the world who in any normal industry would sit in vast oak-lined offices protected by secretaries and large desks. And here, they're right on top of each other, right? They're putting up with all these inconveniences. If Michael Lewis is to be believed, they're getting guacamole thrown on them with some degree of regularity, right? Why are they doing this? They're doing this because knowledge is more important than space, right? And that fundamentally is why cities came back. And that's the fundamental reason for the triumph of the city. Unfortunately, it's not about the triumph of every city, because in fact, skills are the bedrock on which urban success rests. This is the relationship between population growth between 2000 and 2010 and initial population growth in 2000. As you can see, a strongly positive relationship. This is the relationship between share of the population with a college degree in 2000 and per capita GDP across America's cities. This is something economists call human capital externalities. It's not just that having more skills makes one person wealthier, it's having smart people around you makes you wealthier. As the share of people in your area with a college degree goes up by 10%, holding your years of schooling at constant, your earnings go up by 8%. It is very much this process that Alfred Marshall talked about 120 years ago when he wrote that in dense clusters the mysteries of the trade become no mystery but are, as it were, in the air. It's about learning, it's also about getting a job, right? Because that's also what having smart neighbors is about, is that these guys are entrepreneurs. And I will tell you that during the Great Recession of the American experience, the most protective thing a metropolitan area could have is skills. That unemployment rates were vastly lower in the more skilled parts of America relative to the less skilled parts of America. And of course, this is the relationship between per capita GDP in 2010 and PISA math scores across countries in the world. You know, skills are destiny. Skills are destiny at every level. This is how we're doing. The UK is here. This is just the share of students in advanced level math. We've cut off the bottom end of the distribution. The US is exactly in the middle. There's the US. There's the UK, which is doing much better than the US, a little bit worse than Minnesota or Massachusetts. But both of our countries have a long way to go on this, right? We have a huge skills problem, and it's not just Hong Kong, Taiwan, Korea. I was in the Netherlands yesterday. The Netherlands is 6th from the top, Belgium is 5th from the top. It is possible for both of our countries to do much, much better on our education system. Now, of course, the important skills at the city level are not those that are taught in school. As an academic, I'm somewhat amazed when anything I ever say has any practical value whatsoever. And certainly, when you think about it, there's nothing that is more important for the long-run viability of a city than the talent and inclination to be an entrepreneur. 50 years ago, the economist Benjamin Chinitz was looking at New York and Pittsburgh and noting that New York was more resilient than Pittsburgh even then. He argued this was a reflection of the industrial history of New York and Pittsburgh, that New York had the garment trade, an industry with very, very few returns to scale or barriers to entry, in which anyone with a good idea and a couple of sewing machines could get started. And as such, it was a mother of entrepreneurship, right? A place that produced people who would go on to build skyscrapers that reshaped Manhattan, or start movie studios, or go into heavy industry, or become financiers. All of these things were natural to the entrepreneurs of the garment sector because entrepreneurship is flexible human capital. It's all about seeing new opportunities, whether in your narrow industry or thinking more broadly. By contrast, Pittsburgh had U.S. Steel, which trained company men. These guys were great at making sure that the company worked, but their job was not to think about new opportunities in electronic greeting cards, right? Their job was to make sure that the industry worked together. And I think that's another legacy of the great, particularly large firm-dominated, single industry-dominated industrial cities, that they have a real paucity of entrepreneurial capital. It is remarkable, given how mediocre our measures of entrepreneurship are, how powerful they are for predicting economic success at the area level. One measure that we use is just the share of employment in startups at some initial time period. The second measure we use is just the average establishment size. So the areas marked 1 are those that have the smallest average establishment sizes as of 1977. The areas marked 5 have the largest establishment sizes. You know, as you can see, a massive difference in employment growth between 1977 and 2010 between those areas that are marked by small, nimble firms and those areas that are marked by big firms. This is not a question of sector, because this holds within sectors. This is not a question of region. So this is a factor that's just very, very robust. The harder problem from a public policy point of view is what the heck you do about it, right? We all sort of know entrepreneurship is good, but figuring out ways to actually unleash entrepreneurs is very difficult. I mean, I often have a mantra, which is the best thing to do on this is to attract and train smart people and then get out of their way. Now, the most entrepreneurial place I've ever been is the Dharavi slum of Mumbai, a place that is filled with smart, ambitious people connected by the city, learning from one another, and it makes you just cheer at the promise of Indian human capital. But it also makes you weep, because you walk out of some hub of entrepreneurship and you see a kid defecating in an unpaved road, and the water isn't fit to drink and the electricity is intermittent, and it reminds you that there are also demons that come with density. If two people are close enough to give each other an idea face to face, they're also close enough to give each other a contagious disease. Cities are rife with what economists call externalities, both good and bad, and those externalities need management, right? They need actually an effective public sector that is limited, but effective. The most important job for the public sector is clean water, right? Because in fact, if people don't drink clean water, you get cholera epidemics, as indeed have raged most recently through Haiti and Kinshasa. A boy born in, we're in this building, right? So the fact is a boy born in Elizabethan London could expect to give up 7 years in life expectancy relative to living in rural India. That gap was the same as in New York in 1900. Right? Today, of course, life expectancies are about 3 years longer in New York than outside in the U.S. Nobody actually understands why death rates for older New Yorkers are lower. Some people credit walking, some people credit social connections. Among young people, though, the data is really clear. It's lower levels of motor vehicle accidents, so just getting in a bus after having a few pints is just a lot safer than getting behind the wheel of a car. And second, far lower levels of suicide, which is one of my favorite great paradoxes of happiness data, that New Yorkers, people who actually live in urban areas in developing countries, say that they are much happier than people who live in rural countries. New Yorkers do not tell surveyors that they're happy. Now, anyone who actually knows anything about New York should not be surprised by this, but it is also true that New Yorkers are far less likely to commit suicide than other people in the U.S., which tells you maybe not to take the alleged New York unhappiness all that seriously. That didn't happen easily. America's cities and towns were spending as much on clean water at the start of the 20th century as the federal government was spending on everything except for the post office and the army. This was an enormously expensive undertaking, largely marked by smart entrepreneurs. I would just say something in terms of getting the organization right was as important as getting the engineering right, because otherwise the whole thing devolves into a flood of corruption and theft. When cities are able to deal with their downsides of density, when they're able to have effective congestion pricing that makes the streets livable, when they're able to have clean water, they can become places of remarkable pleasure as well as productivity. The same urban competition and innovation that makes for great urban software companies and management consultancies makes for great restaurants, makes for great places to live. And this ability to share urban space, there are a bunch of American companies like Zipcar that are claiming that they are sort of harbingers of a sharing economy for the 21st century. There's nothing new about the sharing economy, right? What is a restaurant? What is an urban restaurant but a shared kitchen and a shared dining room? What is a shared park other than a shared backyard, right? Cities have always been about sharing, and that has only become more valuable as we are able to share more things like cars. There are, however, problems that come with this. What do we do about the cities that aren't thriving? Even more importantly, what do we do about the people who aren't thriving? And I think if I have one mantra on this, it's politicians, because they're place-based, tend to think too much about poor places and too little about poor people. That in fact there's too much of a focus on place-based policies rather than people-based policies. And the third, and the only one that I feel really confident about, right, is the affordability side. How can we make sure that more people are able to afford living in the successful cities? So 3 observations on troubled regions, and one I've said it already. The situation here is far less desperate than in the U.S. I mean, there's really nothing that the U.S. can do that would be remotely sensible that would be about, bringing Detroit back as a city in terms of bringing it back up to having a gain population. The right strategy, which is one that MI has been involved in, is trying to make Detroit safe, trying to make Detroit schools better, trying to create a better future for those kids. And indeed, that brings me to point 3, right? The most important thing when you think about Liverpool or Glasgow or any declining area is to make sure the kids are getting decent schools, make sure that they're not looking over their shoulders when they go to work. Now, part of that, of course, is making sure that their parents have some form of decent employment. So it's not that you can completely divorce the employment side, but it is so easy to squander hundreds of millions of pounds on stupid regional policy that it is something to always be careful about. And this is my favorite example of this, the madness of the Detroit people mover monorail. Right? The hallmark of declining cities is that they have an abundance of structure and infrastructure relative to the level of demand. Detroit was built for 1.85 million people. It now has less than half that. Right? It is easy to get around Detroit. Right? There aren't any cars on the streets. You can see that. You could send a bus at 70 miles an hour down these streets without any problem. Right? And what does Detroit do? Because of the magic of place, because the magic of sort of bringing Detroit back with this fancy technology, it builds a monorail. It's like some bad joke that you're sort of creating infrastructure that couldn't possibly be needed because of this magic of causing Detroit to come back. I would say many of the best investments for a place to focus on is education and entrepreneurship. And since I'm running out of time, I'll leave sort of the entrepreneurship discussion for later. But Detroit certainly can be doing a lot more to actually make it an easy place to start a business. The underemployment problem. As a profession, we haven't solved this one. Education is part of it. So making sure that our education systems are both first-rate in a 21st century sense is part of this. Reducing barriers to working or incentives to stay out of work is really critical. Thinking about various welfare-to-work policies was right for the time, but we need to go further than this. In the U.S., the larger problem is underemployed prime-age males. But I think there's a larger issue here, which is that cities should never apologize for being places of inequality. Cities like London have both rich and poor people, not because they've made people poor, but because they've attracted poor people with the promise of economic opportunity, with the ability to get around without a car for every adult, right? That there's nothing wrong with having inequality come together. In fact, I like that much more than having artificial barriers, which make sure that people only mix with people of their own wealth or kind. The service economy often seems like the likely best course, but I think in general, and that will push towards face-to-face contact, but again, I would push against sort of micromanaging industrial growth. For any of this to work, for cities to provide an engine for working for the underemployment problem, they need to be affordable. Now, here, this is the one area in which economics is clear on this. Housing prices are about supply and demand. They're also about a little bit of madness and mania, and that also comes to it, but in the long run, they get tethered down by supply and demand. So New York has two things going on. The rising line is rising prices, reflecting rising demand for a city that it becomes safer and more economically viable. The declining line is declining number of permits. Just as New York had become more attractive, made it more difficult to build. This is a graph showing high prices along the y-axis and population growth or housing growth along the horizontal axis. The places that build a lot aren't expensive. The places that are expensive don't build a lot. This is the relationship between land use controls and prices. Not all highly controlled places are expensive, but all places that are expensive in the US are highly controlled, right? This is what Jane Jacobs got wrong. She famously looked at old buildings and noted they were cheap, and new buildings and noted that they were expensive, which led her to conclude that the right way to preserve affordability was to make sure that no one built any new buildings on top of old buildings. That is not how supply and demand works, and you don't need to look any further than her own home neighborhood of Greenwich Village, an area that was affordable in the 1950s when she lived there, but for the last 40 years has been frozen in amber, in part thanks to her own efforts as part of the Greenwich Village Historic Preservation District. I'm reliably told that townhouses there start at $8 million, right? This is not affordability, right? This does not mean to suggest that I am against all forms of historic preservation. My father was an architectural historian. I believe that some of our oldest buildings are treasures as precious as anything hanging in the National Gallery. But not every old building is precious, and cities need to change and grow if they are going to survive, if they're going to be inclusive and affordable and dynamic for the 21st century. And indeed, London has grown a lot, which is great, but there is clearly a vast need for more building. And that is building that is not just comfortably off in some other place reached by high-speed rail, but for the city to survive, it needs to be building right here, right, that people can actually walk to on a significant scale. And I want to just throw out a number that New York, when it was already allegedly built up in the 1920s, was building 100,000 units a year in the city, right? That is the type of growth that kept New York affordable in the 1920s, and that is the kind of growth you would need. Demand subsidies, when you have restricted supply, so as following the US model of encouraging people to borrow more with high degrees of leverage to buy housing in the teeth of fixed supply, just means higher prices. Right? This is a very dangerous strategy that the US followed, and I would be wary about following such strategies in the UK as well. The critical element is easing up supply. I've run out of time, so I'll leave this, but I don't want to, there are these challenges, and these challenges are really quite significant. But I think the track record of our species of being able to work miracles, right, in cities is just remarkable. And I at least remain optimistic about all of these problems just because we have done such amazing things when we're connected, when we learn from each other in urban areas. Thank you.
Good morning, my name is Daniel Finkelstein. I'm the chairman of Policy Exchange. It's been my privilege to be here for that fantastic talk. I think Ed was just, as you said, I apologise for going on, but actually I could have taken another 20 minutes at least. I wasn't given any chance of getting bored. So what I want to do now is a little bit of in conversation with me, and then there'll be a chance later for people to answer their own questions. You have an arresting fact right at the beginning of your wonderful book, Triumph of the City, and it says that we could put the whole of mankind, each in their own townhouse, in the state of Texas. And if we wanted to have some roads and businesses, we'd have to put 2 people in every townhouse. So the fact you were putting was to say there's a lot of space, and so we choose to live in cities. But another thought occurred to me: why don't we all live in Texas? In other words, why is it that people don't live in cities, given they have all the advantages that you have suggested?
Well, I think, there's sort of a critical part which often gets lost in my book, but I'm not actually an advocate of a particular lifestyle, right? I'm an economist, and I believe in choice and freedom, and I think it is a great thing that the United Kingdom, like the United States, has options, has different types of places that people can live. And certainly when I started acquiring small children, I also moved to a suburb. I come into work in a city every day. And you know, I've never gotten a good idea working at home in my suburb, but I do manage to type up old ideas, and that works all right. In my case, it's a combination of, you know, my wife's preference for leafy stuff and schools-related issues, which have been a curse on American cities, right? That's it. But you know, preferences are varied, and it's a good thing that we have. And the critical element is we just make sure that people pay for the social cost of their actions. And I tell the story about my own suburbanized life in the book, and that's what I didn't get through there, precisely because I want to make the point about cities and the environment. That in fact, you know, cities tend to be much greener in terms of carbon emissions and than rural areas, and even though they're often depicted as being enemies of the environment. And the key element is not that people shouldn't be free to live in suburbs. They should, just that they should pay for the social cost of their actions, and we shouldn't bar them from moving into cities.
Okay, one of the things that the book prompted as a thought was, I always thought I lived in a city. So I live in Pinner, which is at the edge of London. If you turn out of my house and turn right, you leave London within about 10 paces. But I always thought of myself as living in a city, and it was only when I read your book that I realised I didn't, or at least I didn't think I did. So what actually is a city? You know, because at one point you say Silicon Valley, you talk about Silicon Valley as an example of people moving together to move near each other, and because I've got the underground. The reason why I'm asking this question is because obviously it matters in terms of policies that encourage density. When do you stop encouraging suburbs? And
you know, and again, to be clear, it's not that it's not that I'm in favor of strictly encouraging density. I'm in favor at the national level of having a hands-off approach, right? Of being less restrictive of density, not of artificially pushing it out. But we're so far from there in terms of making it easy to build. But that's still I don't think of this as being a 1-0 thing, and I understand the mind likes dichotomies of city, non-city, but the important thing is there's sort of a range. There's from the sort of extreme of Hong Kong, of being in the midst of what everyone would claim, you know, being in a high-rise apartment in Hong Kong. No one would possibly deny that is the essence of being in a sort of ultra-high-density area, to someone who lives on the outskirts of London or in a leafy suburb of Boston. Clearly, we are part of a city in some way. We are coming into work. We are part of this melting, but we're slightly less urban in different ways. So I think the right answer is there's a continuum.
So what I'm really asking is, you know, if I want to avoid committing suicide, should I move? So, you know, you basically suggest in your book there are advantages to this density, and I just wondered at what point I gain it.
I think every person needs to figure that out for themselves.
Okay, so obviously one of the things that you say often is you just want to remove barriers to the creation of cities. You're not really after creating places. In practice, that's quite difficult, and one of the reasons it's quite difficult is because, as you also say in your book, transport infrastructure often creates cities. Okay, so it was one of your things, small firms, smart people, links to the outside world. Well, small firms and smart people can be place neutral, but transport infrastructure cannot be place neutral. And we have let's test it through asking about HS2. Which you touch on a little, just in one sentence in the book, but it's now very controversial in Britain. Is it a good idea to build big railway systems that swiftly move people between cities, for example?
Well, every form of infrastructure needs to be evaluated with rigorous cost-benefit analysis on its own. There's no way of making a blanket statement about all forms of high-speed rail or anything else. So I think that there are a number of high-speed rail projects just on the east coast of China that probably meet that project. I will also say that the internal Chinese stuff looks like a disaster. The high-speed rails to nowhere inside of China. In the U.S., I believe strongly that there are investments that could be done on the eastern seaboard in terms of speeding up the Acela trains that almost surely make sense. Many of the high-speed rail projects that were predicted in the American interior look like madness at any blush, right? America is just too low density to make that work. Ideally, many forms of transport pay for themselves, right? But in fact, the best way to fund transport is user fees. And when you think about sort of the great hits of transportation investment, the early canals, both here and in the U.S., these were paid for by the firms that actually use this stuff. And how can you possibly be against that? When we move to transport that actually moves poor people around, we don't expect that to happen anymore, and that's reasonable. But we still need to apply cost-benefit analysis seriously. So, given that I haven't seen something that is, compelling on HS2 one way or the other, I will refrain from doing that, but I'm looking forward to Policy Exchange making up my mind for me by providing the last word on this at some future date.
Keep waiting. The other issue about place, in other words, that makes neutrality difficult, is the question of whether or not you let cities die. Because obviously, though there are only half as many people who used to live in Liverpool as lived there before, they still live there, and they vote in elections, and also they matter as people. So it's very difficult for politicians to live. So we've put a huge amount of effort as a country into reviving Liverpool, for example. Would your policy be, well, just let them die?
Look, I mean, I think there are, first of all, the critical issue is to make sure that the people don't get forgotten, right? So I would never favor any policy that says, let's just write off the people of Liverpool, the people of Glasgow, the people of Detroit for that matter, right? It is critical that we remember that they are there, they need help. But it's also critical to make sure that we have policies that deliver value to them. That is the critical issue, that we need to make sure that we have policies that are actually making their lives better off, whether they stay in Liverpool or not, right? And in the US, just once, I want to hear a mayor say, yeah, my city declined by another 100,000 people during my term, but look, I educated them superbly and they went on to get great jobs in Houston, right? Just once I want to hear that, because that is actually their job, is to make sure that those kids go on to get great jobs in Houston. Now, that being said, I think that there is considerably more hope for, particularly those sort of southern stretch of declining cities in the UK than anywhere in the US. And indeed, I can talk about education and safety, but it's not crazy to think a little bit about pro-entrepreneurship policies in these areas, or even lower cost policies around infrastructure that may be helpful. But again, the rule of cost-benefit analysis assiduously applied is right. If I may, I have one story that I love about entrepreneurship in Detroit. That's so one of the things about older areas in this world is they tend to accrete regulations, which they keep even in times when those regulations can be deeply harmful. So one of my personal pet causes in the US is the food truck, right? The food truck, these the trucks that go around that sell, Chinese food or any other form of culinary entrepreneurship that they feel. I was fed when I was a young and impecunious assistant professor by a Chinese food truck, so I feel a certain need to give back to this important industry. And indeed, this sort of great urban entrepreneurship. Now, there's this cause célèbre, this woman who's been trying to start a food truck in Detroit for 18 months. She's been trying to start this food truck and she can't get through the regulatory hurdle. Now the idea that Detroit, like Liverpool, like Glasgow, should be saying no to any entrepreneur who wants to get started feels like madness, right? I mean, it feels like, so I'm on this National Public Radio, the equivalent of the BBC show on this thing, talking about this woman in her food truck with the Detroit Ombudsman too. And we're going on for an hour, and finally this Ombudsman is beaten up the whole time and says, oh lady, just go ahead and start your food truck, we'll never catch you.
Here's another question about Detroit, which also rises out of the book. And it's the question of whether the right people are being asked to pay Detroit's taxes. So one of the issues that some people raised about Detroit, they said the problem was all the districting. The people who live on the outskirts of Detroit are among some of the wealthiest people in the United States because of the insurance industry. The people who are living inside Detroit are incredibly poor. The people on if the tax district was drawn wide enough, actually Detroit would have enough money to pay for itself. But of course the problem with that is that then it involves the people in the centre effectively living off the people on the edge, and maybe will drive people out of the edge of Detroit as well. But I wondered what your reflections were on that argument.
I think it's almost surely true in the US that we've done too much to expect the residents of cities to pay for the social problems of the poor living in those cities. The side note of having rich and poor living cheek by jowl in cities is in fact the poor do need social services. And if you have a more centralized country like the UK, that becomes less of an issue because those social services tend to be provided at a relatively national level relative to the US. If you have those social services provided at a very local level, that can create a strong incentive for the rich just to leave, an artificial one that's actually not healthy. Now, the problem is it's not a natural way to solve this, right? Because if what you end up doing is just taking federal dollars and giving it to the city of Detroit, you end up with sort of a very unhealthy situation where they're living on the largesse of others and not facing strong incentives to manage that cash very, very well. The last thing you would have wanted to do, given the quality of Detroit's management for much of the last 40 years, is to expand Detroit's footprint as a city and to give them more power over the outlying area. So the actual step forward in this is very, very difficult, and I think probably the right way is to think more about independent. If you're going to fund stuff at the federal or state level, you want more independent agencies that are not actually beholden to the local politicians in terms of providing support.
Okay, one last question before I throw it open. What is your favourite city?
That's like asking me what my favorite kid is. You can't possibly answer that. But certainly, I am deeply in love with London, and it's when I'm not near the girl I love the girl I near. To say it was
when Harold Wilson said that he wanted to save the naval dockyards, and then started the next sentence by saying, "Why am I saying that?" And someone shouted out, "Because you're in Chatham."
That's right.
Okay. Thank you so much for both your speech and for your answers to my questions. And now I'm going to throw it open. So I've got those questions just at the back. You were the first person to put your hand up. There are microphones. If you could just wait for them. And if you could just introduce yourself with one half a sentence, that'd be great. Yes.
My name is Will Bradley. I work at the GLA. You said that a lot of the growth was due to warm weather. How do you explain the growth in New York where it's very cold in winter?
The growth in New York when it's very cold in winter.
It's not that cold actually by U.S. standards, believe it or not. But New York succeeds despite the cold winter. I mean, Minneapolis, to give a more extreme example, Minneapolis is in fact by any standard extremely cold in the winter, and Minneapolis is doing quite well. It's a trade-off between skills and ideas and weather, right? I mean, New York has enormous strengths which make people put up with its relatively cold temperatures, and it's the great difficulties of the pro-business environment in the government, right? I mean, New York is not a particularly business-friendly government, despite all the amazing work of the Manhattan Institute over the past 20 years. It has not changed itself into being a place in which every company in New York, in the U.S. goes and says, look, this is an easy place to get started, and yet it succeeds, and it succeeds in part because of its this density of talent that exists and learns from one another. The other places, Minneapolis, is really about sort of hard skills. I mean, Minneapolis is just an extremely well-educated city. Boston would be another example, just an extremely well-educated city. Whereas Chicago, which has done, I'd say middling, but relative to other former Rust Belt cities, extremely well. Chicago's about sort of the more ephemeral skills of the business community relative to the hard skills of the University of Minnesota.
Okay. Yes. I was just here, but that's fine. We'll take that question there and then one here.
Jeff from Beacon Dodson. Cities create wealth. Wealth is now creating enormous amounts of carbon. Building tall buildings creates enormous amounts of carbon, whereas a shed in the woods is negative in that sense. If we really are serious about global warming, shouldn't that social cost be built into things, and how do you see that affect the development of cities with tall buildings versus sheds in the wood with locally grown food?
I'm very grateful for that question. So I had to skip over my environmental slides. It gives me a chance to revisit them. And I like to address this point, and your shed in the woods is so perfect, by telling a story about a young Harvard College graduate on a beautiful spring day in 1844 who actually would live for a year in a shed in the woods on Walden Pond. But before doing that, he went for a walk in the woods outside of Concord, and he did a little fishing, and the fishing was good because there hadn't been much rain lately, and then he came to cook the fish into a chowder. The wind flicked the flames from his fire to nearby dry grass, and the fire started and it spread, and by the time it was done, it was a raging inferno that had burnt down more than 300 acres of prime woodland. Right? This is, in his own day, this young man was castigated as an enemy of the environment. The Concord Freeman called him a flibberty gibbet, which I think was pretty bad for 1844. And indeed, it's hard to think of anyone living in Boston or New York in 1844 who did as much damage to the environment as this young man did. This young man who came to live in a shack in the woods. His book, Walden, is often seen as being the seminal gospel of American environmentalism, and of course he is the secular saint of American environmentalism, Henry David Thoreau. And his book appears to preach a gospel. What a wonderful thing it is for us to live surrounded by nature in shacks in the woods. Whereas his own life, to me at least, preaches a different moral, which is that we are a destructive species, and if you love nature, stay away from it. As indeed Thoreau would have done a great deal of good for nature if he had stayed away from it. Now, my own work on carbon emissions across the United States has looked at both carbon emissions from the way people live in the real world and how they commute in different parts of the U.S. We find very dramatic differences where people who live in low-density areas, holding income and family size constant, use significantly more carbon than people who live in dense urban areas, precisely because they don't actually live in shacks in the woods. What they live in is 3,500 square foot houses, and they drive 50 miles to work. So it's wonderful to hold up the example of Thoreau. And I agree with you, when he wasn't burning down the woods, he was actually probably pretty low carbon footprint. But in fact, when people do actually live in green swarms, they actually are, it's quite difficult in terms of carbon emissions. And one way to see this is that the great growing economies of India and China see their per capita carbon emissions rise, so that's seen in the slowing United States, global carbon emissions go up by about 130%. If they stop at the level seen at wealthy but hyperdense Hong Kong, global carbon emissions go up by less than 30%, right? That's a dramatic problem. Again, I want to reiterate, it is not at all as if I'm saying that everyone needs to live in a high tower. I don't believe that in any stretch of my mind. But I do believe that people should be paying for the social cost of their actions, and we shouldn't be putting barriers to building up.
The gentleman there.
It was a fascinating talk, may I say. You mentioned both Manchester in your talk, and in particular the amazing history of innovation, entrepreneurship, intellectual thought in both locations. I don't think actually many Londoners are aware of that history, particularly in Birmingham, which, as I understand it, produced 3 times as many patents as any other city in the world in the 19th century. But my question is this: can those cities, given their proximity to London, in a massively centralised country in which the main city is so dominant, indeed in the world scale, can those cities ever regain anything like their former position in the world economy?
Oh, I think it's hard to predict anything for sure. One of the great sadnesses in my book is that I had a chapter on Birmingham and Bruges that got cut as being too history-centered for an American audience. But I had a whole chapter on the 18th century innovations around Birmingham, which is just an amazing story, right? How the modern world was created by smart people who stole each other's ideas and did this miraculous stuff. It is certainly true that the sort of primate scale of London is gone, right, for the rest of the region. But high housing prices are also an opportunity, and you're getting HS2, whether or not we think cost-benefit analysis would have said it or not, and that certainly has got to be almost surely another opportunity, as long as the cities don't turn into bedroom communities just for London, which I suspect they won't. I mean, I think actually the urge to build other stuff will continue to be there. So I think it certainly creates challenges, unquestionably. The sort of mixture of business with public power is quite extraordinary here. But I think the track record of change is quite strong, and I wouldn't be writing off. I mean, I don't know which one of these cities, right? It couldn't be, could be Edinburgh. I mean, I don't know which. I mean, you can bet it's likely to be on the more skilled front, but I wouldn't be writing off these places at all. I think there's going to be lots of change in decades ahead.
I'm afraid I've only got room for like 2 questions. I'll take there first, and then I'll take you.
Slightly shorter.
David Wood from London Futurist. You were quite sceptical about the potential for telecommuting and remote working, and you mentioned that you probably had never had a good idea when you were at home. It was only when you were rubbing shoulders with other people that this smartness spread. But isn't the technology for telecommuting, things like Skype and Google Hangouts, changing that? You actually see people's faces on the video screens. Today's meeting is a real-world meeting. We all come here through London to Ironmongers Hall, but I can imagine Policy Exchange in maybe 2 years' time will be holding this meeting much more online. And the needs, therefore, for people to be in cities, isn't that likely to change relatively quickly?
So I'm not really a skeptic on telecommuting. I think there are actually lots of things which would make sense to do from telecommuting. There's a nice paper by Nick Bloom at Stanford showing that actually, these travel agents in China, they let them work at home, and it works perfectly well. When the job is relatively easy to measure, when it's relatively straightforward, when it doesn't require new learning or innovation, telecommuting is just fine. There's no particular problem with it. When the job is about creating new ideas, when it's about coming up with new thoughts, when it's about navigating some new social technological space, I think telecommuting is awful for that. I think it just doesn't work very well. There's a reason why. Look, of all the companies in the world, the one that should be able to do this long distance commuting thing best should be Google, right? And what does Google do? They build the Googleplex, right? They put all their people right on top of each other. They buy 1 million square feet in downtown Manhattan. What does Marissa Mayer at Yahoo do? Does she say telecommuting's fine because we're at Yahoo and we've got technology? No, she bans telecommuting in the organization because she knows that they've got to bump into each other to have ideas. So I don't think connecting in cyberspace is ever going to, to quote myself, is ever going to, compare with sharing a meal or a kiss or a smile. I just don't think that this is about to happen anytime soon.
Yes, and the last question.
Conservative Transport Group. Are there some lessons to be learned for the colder cities that haven't thrived so much in the States by looking at the way Montreal and particularly Toronto have got their underground connectivity? You can get out of your garage in the suburbs and drive to work and go shopping and never surface.
Maybe. I mean, the thing that's crucial about Toronto, though, that's often mentioned, yeah, it's cold, but relative to the rest of Canada, it's actually on the warmer side of it, right? That's the important point. So Toronto is often put up as being the temperature factor is usually within country, the warmest areas grow. So, and Vancouver is thriving even more so. But Toronto has a lot of good things to it. So I think you're right. Thinking about covered spaces is right. Although the north of England is nothing like these places, and often in the UK the winters are more about darkness in terms of the cost relative to actual freezing temperatures. So light almost becomes more important than anything else. The other thing that's so critical about Toronto that I would hold up for Toronto as well as Vancouver, right? It's the Toronto model is high-rise residential. That's what Toronto has fundamentally been about. They have embraced more than any other city in the US the high-rise residential model. Vancouver has done so in a way that is beautiful, as well as effective at delivering space. It's just absolutely, I mean, those green buildings shining up is just a wonderful thing. But this model of actually embracing soaring to the sky, not just for financial services firms, but to provide ordinary space for ordinary people, that is, if people will pay for it, we should have a regulatory apparatus that does not say no to building cities up, to dreaming bigger.
Professor, thank you so much. You've been brilliant.